Khazad-Dum, or to give it its more familiar name Moria, is an ancestral home of the Dwarves, founded in the ancient days by the legendary Durin the Deathless. Its inhabitants boast some of the finest arms and armour in Middle-earth, along with legendary dwarven hardiness, both of which carry great import against their most natural foes, the orcs and goblins that infest the mountains around them. Almost always outnumbered and with little in the way of natural allies after secluding themselves behind the doors of Durin, every dwarf counts. Hence, they prefer a more conservative style of warfare, content to let waves of foes break against an unwavering shield wall. The first and most obvious strength of this faction is of course the heavy infantry. The Dwarves of Khazad-Dum seem to have a heavy infantry unit for every occasion, be it pikemen, spearmen, shock infantry, or basic heavy melee infantry. Very few will want to take a straight fight with the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum's main infantry line, instead preferring to attempt to circumvent it, although this is easier said than done in certain situations, particularly in their homeland of Moria. However, while their heavy infantry is good in almost all aspects, the one thing that really stands out about the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum in particular is their staying power. Even their more attack-focused shock infantry will tend to stick in the fight longer than any human equivalents, for example. And this mainly comes down to three aspects: their high armour values, their high shield values, and their high morale values, all of which contribute to the fact that even if you have them greatly outnumbered, the dwarves are unlikely to flinch in the face of your assault. And something else worth mentioning, which may come as a surprise to many people who have played the dwarves in the past, is the fact that the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum have passable archers and defensive cavalry. Now, by no means are you going to be able to win a cavalry fight against a very cav-heavy faction, nor will you be able to skirmish with the likes of the elves, but the fact remains that you are now able to put up a decent presence on the field in both of these aspects, meaning that no longer will the dwarves be marooned and always forming nuke boxes. Instead, you do have some impetus to either move forward or to form a more comprehensive defence with ranged and cavalry units helping you out. It's naturally not all good news for the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, however, and their most obvious weakness has always been a weakness of the Dwarves, of course, and that is that they are quite monumentally slow. This comes as a bit of a problem as well when you consider that the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum will obviously be a more defensive faction on an open field, so if you do see a gap in your lines that your enemy is obviously moving to exploit, getting some troops over there to plug the gap can take just a little bit longer than it would for other factions, which of course can prove to be fatal, particularly if it's a very nasty Lancer cavalry charge. And speaking of Lancer cavalry, another weakness of the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum is the fact that they have no Lance cavalry of their own. This means that they won't be able to get any really nasty hammer and anvil charges on the enemy, which is a potentially very powerful tactic when you consider the fact that the Dwarven front line would act as a very strong anvil indeed. But this also comes as no surprise really, as the Dwarves aren't really known for their cavalry, particularly being down here in the mines of Moria. They do have cavalry of course, but it is only mercenary cavalry and no such mercenary lance cavalry exists. And the final weakness I care to mention is a bit of an interesting one, because it might come as a bit of a surprise to those who have played the Dwarves in the past, and that is the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum having no crossbows, or at least no foot crossbows. Now this can be a bit of a problem, considering the fact that foot crossbows offer you a tremendous amount of stopping power and AP damage in a short amount of time, and they can also be used to correct mistakes in your line. At least when it comes to a cavalry charge, for example, a quick crossbow volley can cut them down to size pretty quickly, and this is something that the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum no longer have access to. Archers can do this job against lighter cavalry, but more heavily armoured cavalry will weather that storm relatively easily. Combined with the fact that one of the other weaknesses I mentioned was that they are slow, this means that there is less margin for error with the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, considering they don't really have a tremendous amount of close-range stopping power. This is combined with the fact that you can only field one unit of axe throwers at a time, which does mean that when the enemies get closer, you're much better off trying to get them into melee rather than skirmish with them at close range. A faction like Rudour, for example, would be able to cut you down to size pretty quickly with those javelins. But now that we've gone through some of the more general things about the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, let's move on to their roster and have a look at each unit in detail. And of course we start off with the dwarven answer to militia, the miners. Now this is going to be what you would have if you wanted some chaff units in amongst the dwarves, and the primary reason for bringing the dwarven miners will be to add some numbers to your army, because as the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, chances are you're probably going to be outnumbered if you're facing off against a kingdom of men, or obviously against the orcs. It's only really against the elves where you can count on having a numbers advantage, and against the elves you might actually want to be aggressive as well. But the Dwarven Miners are a somewhat interesting militia unit because they are functionally quite different. Most of the human militia units, which most people are quite familiar with, tend to put a focus around trying to be as survivable as possible for the cost. Now, the Dwarven Miners are a little bit different in this sense because there are less of them per unit. You know, there are over 200 on Huge per militia unit for the Kingdoms of Men, whereas the Dwarven Miners sit at 178. Obviously, the 179 is because the General is in this unit, which you might see if you're playing against WK. But the main thing to note is that they are a shock infantry militia because they are focused around attack and their charge bonus. And if you have a look at their abilities at a glance, being effective against armour is a big one because you are essentially spending a relatively low amount of money. I think it is actually only 350, so that might be a misprint there. But the being effective against armour for such a cheap unit is a big one. Now, obviously, they do trade this out because they are probably the antithesis of what Khazad-Dum are traditionally about. You know, Khazad-Dum, the armour, the shields, and the high morale, that's what you attribute to most of their infantry, whereas the Dwarven Miners don't really seem to follow this trend. But having said that, they are very useful for padding out your line. So if you bring like a couple of units of miners with what money you have left over, that's a pretty healthy amount of men you've got, and it's armor piercing damage as well with a powerful charge, and they also have very good stamina, so they do have some pretty good traits for a militia unit. Having said that, they are quite fragile. Now actually, if we have a look down here as well at the other unit, you can see that if you upgrade the armor, some of the unit models gain this sort of scale mail or chain mail sort of armor, but it is any armor that you can any unit you can upgrade the armor of does have some sort of change in the unit models, but the Dwarven Miners are honestly one of the tamest changes when you upgrade the armor, but they do get sort of a nice chain coat there. So yeah, the Dwarven Militia, they do have some decent traits to them, but obviously for the most part they are going to be the chaff of your army. For the first quote-unquote real unit of the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, we have the Warriors of Khazad-Dum, the basic Dwarven infantry unit that is honestly quite reasonably priced. I mean, 600 is not an awful lot for a Dwarven infantry unit, you might think, and that's only a little bit more than the Kingdoms of Men might expect to pay for their infantry, or it's actually on par with some of them even. And if you have a look at some of their stats, we can note a few things which are very significant. For one thing, their attack is actually pretty high. I mean, an attack of 9 is significantly more than some of the Kingdoms of Men could expect to see from a unit of similar nature. There is also the fact they have 164 men in the unit, which is really not bad at all for a Dwarven infantry unit like this. And they can also make shield wall, which is very, very rare for a sword and board unit in the current patch. In fact, it's one of the things that the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum can really leverage against their opponents. The fact that most of their mainline infantry units, as well as their spearmen, can form shield wall. This really helps out with their mass, and this is what really provides that legendary Dwarven mass, the fact that most of their infantry can do this. They of course have a shield, and again the shield value of 8 is pretty good. It's pretty standard, to be honest, for most of their heavy infantry units, even for the Kingdoms of Men. But the fact that the Dwarven sort of forces, their armour is also pretty decent. But again, it's something similar to what you might expect from the Kingdoms of Men, but overall it's really the shield wall I would really point out as being the really important thing in this unit, which really sets them apart, and also the higher attack even, which is it's pretty nice to see. But now we'll move on to the other sort of basic Khazad-Dum unit, I feel. But just before we do that, it is worth saying as well that you can have 6 of these Warriors of Khazad-Dum before the cost increases, so very much akin to the Ironfoot Warriors of the previous patch. They can potentially make up a huge amount of your army, and it might be something that your opponent doesn't see coming, and if you want to go for a Khazad-Dum rush build, this may be something you want to consider. Now we come to the basic pike unit of Khazad-Dum, the Sentries of Khazad-Dum, a potentially very important unit considering Khazad-Dum's more defensive nature. Pikes can be a very big part of that. I wouldn't call them an overly cheap pike, but they're not exactly expensive, certainly middle of the road in terms of cost at 600. Obviously they do everything pikes can. They form spear wall, they have a huge bonus versus cavalry. Cavalry's going to drop very quickly in sustained melee with pikemen. But comparing them to sort of basic units from other factions, we can see that they are mostly on par with pretty decent pike units from other factions, honestly. They're probably just a little bit under. The Guards of Osgiliath, to be honest with you. The Guards of Osgiliath have got slightly more defence than the Sentries of Khazad-Dum, but you have to remember that you can have more of these guys. So I really like them, particularly on an open field where Khazad-Dum traditionally may find themselves a little bit more on the back foot because of their lower speed. But having this many pikes, I would use pikes, the Sentries of Khazad-Dum anyway, in a different way to how I would normally use them. Usually I like to send my pikes in to really back up my infantry because it makes my front line very solid. But the Khazad-Dum front line is solid enough as it is, to be honest with you. The Sentries of Khazad-Dum, I feel, will be much better placed, really zoning out cavalry in the backlines. Having this many pikes makes it really very, very risky for an opponent to come in for a big charge, because if their cavalry gets stuck on the Sentries of Khazad-Dum, that's going to be a lot of them dying really very, very quickly. And in an open field, I would suggest probably all 4 Sentries of Khazad-Dum that you can bring would probably be worth taking along. In a siege, of course, pikes are always going to be very useful because they can clog up a choke point when they're supported with infantry very, very well. It's not the only pike unit that Khazad-Dum have, so if you wanted to go for the more expensive pike unit, which we'll see a little bit later on, you could potentially do that as well. But definitely one of the gems in the Khazad-Dum roster, I feel like. I feel like most of their armies are going to be built around this unit purely because of how cost-effective it can be and how it can potentially make up for some of the more glaring weaknesses in the Khazad-Dum line. Now we come to a unit that you probably won't see too much when you're facing against the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, and one you probably won't find yourself bringing either. We have the Mercenary Guildsmen. This is mainly because the mercenary units that are really important to the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum are the mounted variety. It's not to say the Mercenary Guildsmen themselves are bad, it's just that the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum have got options in this area that are superior to the Mercenary Guildsmen, and they can bring quite a lot more. Really, the only thing they have going for them is that they have quite a lot of men in the unit. They have 181, which is in excess of the Warriors of Khazad-Dum, and it's also nearly as much even as the Militia tier miners. So if you did find yourself lagging behind a little bit in terms of numbers, you might want to bring them. But even so, they have stats which are much more comparable to the standard Kingdoms of Men, probably slightly worse in some cases. For example, I have the stats of the Gondor infantry in front of me, and the only difference really between the 2 units is the fact that the Gondor infantry have got more defence and more of a shield bonus, and other than that they're the same unit. They also cost 650 to recruit, which is even more than the standard Warriors of Khazad-Dum, so again, it's pretty questionable if you were to bring them. And also, perhaps the thing which will let them down most of all is people who fight for pay, of course, are much less likely to stick around when things get hairy, so that means they have lower morale, and considering that the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum traditionally have got very high morale, if you have a weak spot in your line, that may well be exploited, particularly by a fear-causing faction like the Orcs. Not to say they're completely useless, of course. The numbers can bring something to your army, and they are relatively well armoured, but most of your other options in this area are going to be superior to the Mercenary Guildsmen. The other foot-based mercenary unit is something that the Dwarves might want to consider in certain cases, however, because the Mercenary War Chiefs are a shock unit, but they are not an AP shock unit. They are a more skill-based shock unit with their 2-handed Zweihanders. Now, in terms of their stats, they do lag a little bit behind some of the higher tier swordsmen from, like, the Kingdoms of Men, for example, like the Cairandrel Swordmasters, or the dismounted Fornost Arraign Knights, I think they're called now, from Arthedain. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. But nonetheless, the Mercenary War Chiefs do fill a bit of a void in the Dwarven line. It's not to say the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum lack skill, because they are actually more skilled than their eastern cousins in many cases. But even so, they do lack just a swordsman, a 2-handed swordsman, which is more based around killing lightly armoured targets. So potentially against someone like the Elves, this might come in handy, if you are able to back them up, of course. Now, in terms of armour, they do lag behind a little bit in terms of armour next to the rest of the Dwarven roster, as you might expect. But their attack value is honestly not bad. 11 attack is pretty high. It's just a little bit shy of some of the elite Kingdoms of Men swordsmen, but at 750, it's not a bad price for them, honestly. But they do still suffer a little bit from the same thing that mercenaries do suffer with, and that is, of course, that they have slightly lower morale, so you do need to support them, otherwise this shock infantry will break very, very quickly, particularly against the sort of factions you're going to want to use them against. They can cut their way through lightly armoured orcs as well, so if you need the trash men to deal with the low tier goblins and orcs that might be coming at you, then the Mercenary War Chiefs might not be too bad a unit to use. There are only 139 of them in the unit, so they don't have as much as their sword and board cousins. But yeah, I can see why you would potentially want to bring them in some matchups, unlike the Mercenary Guildsmen. but even so, it is going to be a unit you're going to have to babysit quite a lot to get the best out of, I feel. From here on, we really start to get into some of the really high-tier Dwarven stuff, which is where you could say their primary strength lies, and we start off here with the Hammers of Gundabad, a potentially lethal AP shock unit. They have a very high armor value of 14. Now this is going to make them a little bit more resilient to projectiles and also in melee against units which are not AP. So where they're most at home is going to be fighting against sort of basic swordsmen. Swordsmen are not AP, of course, and this is where their high armor value is really going to come into play, and also their very high attack values with that AP is going to mean you're going to slice your way through basic, for example, heavily armoured human infantry, or even the orcs, something like the Uruks, which are going to be pretty much dependent on their armour for staying alive. The Hammers of Gundabad are going to very quickly cut their way through them. They also have quite a lot of utility. They can use sharpened stakes, which is interesting for a shock unit, and it is also very useful for the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, who are traditionally going to be adopting a bit more of a defensive posture on an open field, and the Hammers of Gundabad could be used in the late game after you've done absorbing the pressure from the cavalry to finish off what's left of the opposing infantry. Now it is worth saying that there is a potential weakness here in the fact that they don't have shields. Now this does mean that despite the fact their armour will protect them against lower tier archer volleys, higher tier archers are going to do a pretty hefty amount of damage to them, because the Hammers of Gundabad, unlike previous builds, do not have multiple HP, so you do need to be careful with them because they do cost 850. From here on out, most of the units you're going to be seeing, at least in a melee capacity, are going to be pretty expensive. They're going to be your more elite core, and the Hammers of Gundabad could potentially be one of the things that your opponent is going to want to single out purely because of the amount of AP damage they can do in melee. 114 of them per unit is not bad. An attack of 12, considering its AP, could potentially be very lethal to certain factions which are more reliant on their armour. They do have a pretty good amount of defensive skill, however, and this comes from the fact they lack a shield entirely, because if they didn't have skill to compensate for that, they would potentially lose out a little bit, because a defensive skill of 6 is honestly not bad for a Warhammer based unit. Warhammer and Battle Axe units, you can usually expect to have a melee skill of around 3, which is pretty woeful, and that's the sort of thing which the elves can really take advantage of. But yeah, the Hammers of Gundabad, very lethal AP unit, not the only lethal AP shock unit that the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum have either, but this is one of your two options when it comes to sort of a more offensive based unit like this. Now we move on to the Legionary units of Khazad-Dum, arguably where their faction really gains its identity and its true strength. Now, I will be doing these a little bit out of order to how they appear in the unit roster, simply because I want to do them in order of the numerical order of the legions. It would bother me if it wasn't, because they're all over the place in terms of cost for that. So we're going to start off, ironically, with the most expensive of the Legion units, the 1st Legion Pikes. And they cost 1,100 each to bring, so they are a very expensive pike unit. You can, however, have 2 before the cost increases, and this is definitely a siege-focused unit, I feel, because in an open field they are definitely going to be singled out, simply because they can be used to shore up your front line almost indefinitely against a lesser opposition, so they're definitely going to be coming under arrow fire, crossbow fire, javelin fire, all of that. And also the fact that they will probably just be circumvented entirely, whereas in a siege this is much more difficult to do. The enemy is going to be forced to try and go through them more often than not. And in terms of their stats, well, let's have a look here. With an attack of 11 is a huge amount for a pike unit in formation. If these guys are backed up, they are going to be one of the finest pikes you can field. Now they're going to be sort of mentioned in the same vein as the pikemen from Imladris or Arthedain. That's the sort of pike you can expect them to be. And of course they can form the basis of your defence in many ways. They are very expensive, of course. To bring both of them, that will cost 2,200 florins, which can be the lion's share of your money on the defensive side. So there is still a case for saying that maybe you want the lower tier pikes instead of these guys, but in a choke point heavy siege, even on the attack, the 1st Legion pikes can be very, very useful indeed. An armour score of 12 is very high. They also have a shield value because of the shields on their backs. Admittedly, it's only a shield value of 2, so higher tier archers are still going to be making a beeline for this unit. But even so, definitely, you know what to expect from higher tier pikes, unless you try and affect the fight from some sort of external source, like rear charging them or using ranged units. They're going to be holding for a very, very long time. And of course that legendary Dwarven mass. Now we have the second most expensive Legion unit, and that is the 2nd Legion Axe Guard, the Shock Infantry Legionaries. And they do have a alternative unit model for the upgraded armour, so we'll have a look at the unit model as well, because obviously they have the different symbol on their shields, and then as we move over we can see the more heavily armoured variant over here, which looks very, very cool indeed. You know, definitely very reminiscent of the Axemen of Erebor, which of course we will get onto at a later date when the Dwarves of Erebor get this treatment. But looking at the 2nd Legion, they cost exactly the same as the Hammers of Gundabad, and they are a very equivalent unit because they are of course effective against armour, being a two-handed battle axe unit. So what is really the difference between them? Well, the 2nd Legion Axe Guard are, to my mind, the safer alternative, mainly because they have the higher defense. They also have a higher base attack value, interestingly enough, as well. They also have a shield, which means they are slightly more resilient to arrows. The shield value of 5 is admittedly still not a huge amount, but it is going to protect them that little bit more, particularly when you upgrade the armour, of course. Now, this is the upgraded armour variant, you can see, which has got more defence. If we were to have a look at the other unit, that would be less, I believe. Or is it just going to give me the same one? Oh. Nope, it's not going to do that. So, apologies for that. But yes, the 2nd Legion Axe Guard we have. It is still going to be quite risky to bring on an open field because they are going to be immediately picked out by your opponent as the genuine damage dealers in your army. I feel like Cavalry is immediately going to try and charge them so as to take the teeth away from your army a little bit. Having said that, if you get to the late game when there's going to be no cavalry buzzing around, or maybe you're up against an army which doesn't have much cavalry either, something like Gundabad for example, the 2nd Legion Axe Guard are going to be really very, very good in that matchup, simply because the AP is going to be very useful, their high attack value is going to be very useful to cut through the legions of orcs very quickly. The melee skill is maybe a little bit lacking when you look at it, but you know, I would say that a skill of 8, you know, a defensive skill of 8 for a two-handed axe unit is really not bad, because as I've said, most of the basic two-handed axe and hammer units can only expect a melee skill of 2 or 3, so definitely a very hardy unit, quite expensive at 850 however, so you do need to be careful with them. But yeah, you know what to expect from a two-handed dwarven axe unit. They're going to make armoured units regret being alive very, very quickly. Now we move on to the 3rd Infantry. The 3rd Legion Infantry. And this, of course, is the basic melee infantry contingent of the Legions of Khazad-Dum. They too have an upgrade model, and I think the reason the 1st Legion don't is because they already start off with this sort of more heavily armoured unit model. But having a look at what the 3rd Legion are, of course, if you compare them to the Warriors of Khazad-Dum, which is what you're going to be doing, they are more expensive, of course, 675, but 675 is not a huge amount still. They can still form shield wall, of course, you know that. It's going to be a sort of standard thing for the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum. Shield wall is going to be a very central pillar in how they hold their front line together. But the differences really are that the 3rd Legion are just a bit superior in every way. You know, their attack is higher, their defense is higher, their armor is higher, their skill is higher, their shield value is higher as well, I believe. And they even have a slightly higher charge bonus as well, which is not really what melee infantry are going to be doing most of the time, but even so, still going to be something they're slightly superior at. The one area in which you could say they aren't, very, very rightly, is the fact that they have significantly less men in the unit. However, with all of the stats, if you're going for a more quality-centric army, then the 3rd Legion are definitely going to be what you want to do, because obviously higher tier dwarven infantry is going to be really very, very resilient in the face of the enemy. In a sort of straight head-on fight, they're going to be able to take on most of what comes at them, and 675 is quite a reasonable cost, I think, for what this unit offers you. Really, the weakness of the 3rd Legion, as with the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum as a whole, is if you're outflanked. You know, if you're going to bring the 3rd Legion as your front line, you're basically going to be surrendering the numbers advantage against any faction other than the Elves, simply because of the amount of men they have in the unit for a mainline sort of infantry unit that you're going to be relying on holding your front line. But yeah, I mean, obviously the 3rd Legion, if you can prevent them from being outflanked, if you can prevent them from being surrounded in that crescent moon fashion, because that will happen if they are isolated, then they will hold your line together really very, very well. It won't hurt maybe to mix the 3rd Legion infantry and the Warriors of Khazad-Dum, so you have the best of both worlds. Both can form shield wall after all, and it's going to be really very, very difficult to break them down from the front, of course, particularly with the high shield value, the high armor value, and the very high defensive values. And an attack value of 12 on a sword and board unit that only costs 675 is pretty damn good, and especially in a siege, of course, where the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum are going to be most at home. It is also worth mentioning, just in a similar vein to the Warriors of Khazad-Dum, who can have 6 before the cost increases, you can have 4 3rd Legion before the cost increases. So less, but that's to be expected from a higher tier unit, of course, but still, 4 units of 3rd Legion. That's not an easy prospect for anyone to go up against unless they've either got some very good armor piercing or have some very high skill values to overwrite the Dwarven skill. And the final numbered Legionary unit, the 4th Legion Shield Guard, the Spearmen, are arguably the most important of the Legion units, because this is one that I can see being the glue that holds the Khazad-Dum army together. And this is primarily because if you look at their stats, they are really very, very powerful for Spearmen. They have a higher attack than you would expect from most spears, so if we compare them, to example, to a very good Kingdoms of Men spear unit, the Gondorian spears, they have double the attack value of them. They also have a significantly higher defense, a total defense of 26. Pretty skillful as well, at 7, for spears, that's not half bad. An armor value of 9, which again is pretty good, which will increase if you upgrade the armor model, which we shall go over here. And of course, you know the drill by now, the full armor variant of the Shield Guard, which looks really very, very cool indeed. Their shield value is also 10, which is very, very impressive. And of course, they can form shield wall, but then forming shield wall as a spear unit is sort of par for the course, so it's not really worth sort of dwelling on for too long, unlike with the Dwarven infantry. It says they have very long spears, but this is inaccurate because that is a pike trait. They do have a bonus fighting cavalry, however, which is going to be very, very important, because obviously if the cavalry that you are fighting stops for any length of time, as the Dwarves, you want and need in many ways to be able to punish it severely for that, because cycle charging is really going to be the primary thing you're going to have to watch out for in a situation like a 1v1 field battle. And the 4th Legion Shield Guard can really make it very, very difficult for the enemy cavalry to cost effectively trade with your army as a whole, particularly if you've got a lot of pikes, a lot of spears. It really puts the ball in your opponent's court with regards to making them use their cavalry to the best of their abilities. If they don't, you can punish them very, very severely, because the 4th Legion Shield Guard, having an attack value of 8 and a bonus versus cavalry means that if you leave cavalry in melee with them for any length of time, at least the lower tier of cavalry, the stuff that doesn't have hit points, they're going to be dragged down pretty quickly. They only have 114 men in the unit, however. They cost the same amount as the 3rd Legion. I would say probably I would bring the 4th Legion Shield Guard a lot of the time over the 3rd Legion, unless I was very sure my opponent wasn't really bringing much in the way of cavalry. And also something else which is worth mentioning, you can bring 5 before the cost increases, so there is the potential that they will be the primary infantry unit on the front lines a lot of the time, I feel, in a siege and on the field, because they really are very, very good. Those stats for spearmen, they are powerful. Now, they do have a malus versus infantry spearmen, so there is a case for saying that you will need to back them up if you're going up against a very infantry heavy faction, something like Gundabad. But even so, I feel as though the 4th Legion Shield Guard, with their mass, with how powerful they are defensively, which is how you're going to be playing as Khazad-Dum in the vast majority of cases, they're almost too good to pass up. So that really rounds off the primary Legion units. We do have 1 Legion unit left to go. But from here on out, we're going into the so-called Uber or Ultra tier of units. Now we come to the Legion Bodyguard, the pinnacle of the Khazad-Dum Legion units. Now, obviously, this is going to be reserved really for a General's Bodyguard type deal. Seeing these guys in action before, they are very, very powerful indeed. Obviously, you do need to support them, because the one weakness that all units like this will have, of course, is the fact that they do have quite a low amount of men in the unit. I mean, 68 without the General, but you can view it as a 69-man unit for the most part, because most of the time Balin himself will be part of the General's Bodyguard unit, and you can see Balin back here. He is the General's Bodyguard model for the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, as I sort of get back into position over here. Having a look at what they're all about, obviously you can expect very big numbers, an attack value of 20. You can see that the total defense is 32 as well, which in the current patch is really very, very powerful indeed. A shield value of 8, which is pretty respectable. We also have a defense skill of 12, which for a sword and board unit such as this is impressive. An armor value of 12, which again is very high. But of course, the key thing is they do have multiple HP. 2 HP, very, very difficult to wear down. Obviously, if you can isolate the Legion Bodyguard, they will drop relatively quickly, especially to an AP unit. But if you can embed them in your line and really keep them there, that's going to be what you want to do. They frighten nearby enemy infantry, excellent morale, powerful charge, very good stamina. Interestingly enough though, the eagle that inspires nearby troops, this is a pretty big one because they have the passive ability that they give 10 morale to all units within a 25 meter radius. Now the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum aren't known for their low morale anyway, which means that if you have this unit in the middle of your infantry line, you can effectively say that it's unbreakable. You know, the only thing that's really going to break them is if you've got fire arrows flying in, getting rear charged by really powerful cavalry, you're already surrounded on all sides by infantry. So really you can view, if you've got your formation sorted and it's tidy, the Legion Bodyguard is going to render your front line unbreakable, which is going to make your opponent's life really very, very difficult, especially if they're playing the Orcs. Some factions like Mordor, which really can rely on fear for the most part to break enemy infantry lines, you're going to have very little such luck against the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum if they have decided to bring the Legion Bodyguard. So yeah, this is the first of the 3 Uber tier sort of sword and board units that you have the option between. The Legion Bodyguard, I hesitate to call them the budget option, but they are the cheapest at 1200 florins, not that that's a small amount of money to invest in a single unit. But we'll have a look at the other 2 and see what they're all about as well. Well, actually we do have sort of 4 Uber tier units, although I'm actually not sure that I would call the Sons of the Fallen Uber tier anymore. I would just call them high tier. You can have 2 before the cost increases for 1, and for an Uber tier unit you really need to be only having 1. And also the fact that they only have a single hit point as opposed to the 2. They do still cost 1,000, which is no small amount of money. It's sort of on the similar vein to the 1st Legion pikes here. Obviously they are better spears than the 4th Legion shield guard. It's a similar sort of dynamic between the lower tier spears here and the higher tier spears here, as it is between the 1st Legion and the sentries of Khazad-Dum, because obviously you have the quality, but there are less of them, against the quantity, but there are more of them. But having a look at the stats, obviously total defense of 31 is very high, the armor value of 14 is enormous, the shield value of 8 is also very high. Archers are going to really struggle to get through to these guys. It's going to really take sort of crossbows or one of the very few AP archers to knock them out knock them down to size really quickly. The defense skill of 9 is also high for a spear unit. Of course, you expect all of these things to be very high. They can make shield wall, of course, bonus fighting cavalry. They frighten nearby enemy infantry as well, which is sort of something you can expect from the higher tier dwarven units. It says again that they've got very long spears, but again I think that that's wrong, because I do believe that is a pike only descriptor, and I think that the spears don't have that. If they did, the spearmen for the dwarves would be outrageously overpowered with these stats here. But they too have the ability to inspire nearby troops in a 25 meter radius with that plus 10 morale, in the same way that the Legion Bodyguard do. And you can have 2 of these, so you can tie up pretty much your entire front line if you were to go spear heavy. Yeah, I like the Sons of the Fallen. You know, having 1,000 for it's a bit more mobility than the 1st Legion offer you, so I can certainly see them being brought on an open field. In a siege as well, although in a siege I can see people opting for maybe other more expensive units. But even so, you know what to expect from the Sons of the Fallen from the previous patch. Don't expect them to do quite the same amount of heavy lifting as they did previously, but with the stat crunch, that's going to be something which is more of a universal fact of life than just something like a Sons of the Fallen nerf. But yes, very impressive stats all around, and the fact that you can have 2 only raises them in my eyes. I think that could really help tie together a dwarven line against a lot of cavalry pressure, particularly if you went spear and pike heavy. It could really make the enemy's life difficult. I'm sure many of you have been waiting for this unit to appear, the mighty Mithril Guard. In the previous patch, probably the strongest of the sword and board units, although now it's a little bit more debatable. Having said that, they do still have several things which make them an absolute monster on the field. Based on what they're all about, again, it's going to be similar to the Legion Bodyguard. They have the same sort of inspiration mechanic. They can also make shield wall. They frighten nearby enemy infantry. Their stats are also very, very high. They have the highest base defense of any of the dwarves at 34, with 14 armor, which is very high indeed. A defense skill of 12 as well, which means they're not going to be easily outskilled by just any old riffraff. A shield value of 8 as well, which is respectable. It's not huge, but then most basic shield units will most units with a basic shield like this anyway will have something similar. It's going to really take something like a tower shield to push them into the teens, for example. They have a charge bonus of 9 as well, which is not bad, an attack of 20. And really the most important thing here is this is an attack bonus of 20 that is effective against armour. You know, this is something which you're not going to be seeing a great deal of, because most units that are effective against armour are not going to be shielded infantry. Obviously this is a bit of an exception because it is an ultra tier dwarven unit, but you know, an effective against armour unit that's as tough as this, that has an attack bonus of 20, I can see them being very, very difficult for certain factions to break down if it comes to that. The Mithril Guard are of course something which everyone is going to notice very, very quickly, and they're going to single them out as the biggest threat on the field in some cases to them. So if they can charge them with cavalry, if they can focus them down with crossbows and or javelins, that's going to be the primary risk to bringing the Mithril Guard, as with any of the high tier dwarven units really. But the Mithril Guard especially, simply because that effective against armour could be a terror in the night against something like the elves, not the elves, sorry, something like the Kingdoms of Men or the Orcs. The elves, I was going to say, would be the exception to this, because the elves don't rely on their armour quite so much. It's much more about skill, and while the Mithril Guard do have some skill, they won't be able to match up to some of the higher tier elven units. So if you're up against the elves, or if you were expecting maybe not so much in the way of armour, you might want to choose the alternative, which we will move on to now, the most expensive unit in the Khazad-Dum roster. Something I'm interested in seeing is whether the Guards of Khazad-Dum have reclaimed their old title as being the strongest heavy infantry unit in the game from their cousins, the Mithril Guard, because it is an interesting matchup, I would say. On the face of it, they are quite similar. The Guards of Khazad-Dum, however, do have a slightly lower total defence value, where the Mithril Guard has 34, the Guards of Khazad-Dum have 31. But still, the armour value is very high. It's the shield value where the Guards of Khazad-Dum are a little bit lower in this case. They have only 5, whereas the Mithril Guard had a higher value. Obviously, the other thing which is noticeable against the Guards of Khazad-Dum here is they do not have the AP that the Mithril Guard do, which is more commonplace for a sword and board unit, as I've seen, or axe and board unit. And you might think, well, why would I bring the Guards of Khazad-Dum then? They're 100 florins more for a unit which doesn't have AP and has a slightly lower total defence. Why would I bring them over the Mithril Guard? And there is one very big reason for that. Actually, they also don't inspire nearby troops, which is again a potential thing, because it means that your line won't be quite so tidy, although having said that, the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum do have pretty high morale values anyway. There is one very important reason why you would want to bring the Guards of Khazad-Dum, and that is that they have retained a hit point value of 3, and that is exceptionally rare in the current patch. I can't tell you, hit points have been toned down across the board. The fact that the Guards of Khazad-Dum are still a 3 HP infantry unit means that 1-to-1, unless you have some serious AP, like the Mithril Guard, ironically enough, or if you have something at range which can deal with them, or if you can cycle charge them, the worst thing you can do is get into a sustained melee with them with units that cannot scratch them, because the Guards of Khazad-Dum, in typical Dwarven fashion, will bulldoze their way through them. I can definitely see them being more popular in a siege battle simply because of their enormous cost. I mean, 1400 florins is a lot of money to sink into a single unit. I mean, that's damn, thinking about how the infantry works, I mean, that's basically 2.5 Dwarven infantry units. However, the amount of havoc they can cause against certain armies is going to be significant, of course. In Shield Wall, the Guards of Khazad-Dum, we'll see how well they perform in the future, I'm sure, when defending the bridge of Khazad-Dum, but that 3 HP is going to be big. It's going to make them very, very tricky to break down. Again, in an open field, I would say probably a little bit too risky to bring them, simply because they are so expensive and they will be made a target of. The enemy's going to see them, and they're going to see the value that they can get off a single charge against the Guards of Khazad-Dum and really try and worm their way into your lines. But in a siege, where your opponent is going to have much less options with regards to how to deal with them, and they may have to take them head on, I want to see how many kills they can potentially get, because I think they could really do some damage in that situation. But yes, the 3 Dwarven sword and board ultra tier units are all very, very powerful. And they are going to be, in a siege, attack or defensive, very, very difficult to deal with. Even on an open field though, if they're embedded in a Dwarven infantry line and difficult to get to, they could very well grind out a victory there as well, where traditionally they would be at a disadvantage. They are very strong indeed. As I said at the start, a solid archer option is not really something you would associate historically with the Dwarves. Now, the Orc Hunters have been a part of Reforged for a little while, but they are now, exclusively a Khazad-Dum unit, the Orc Hunters of Khazad-Dum. Obviously, they can use sharpened stakes, which again, that is potentially a very useful tool in an open field battle, just to make cavalry that little bit more wary. And really countering cavalry is going to be one of the main things with the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum. Something else the Orc Hunters can do in that vein is ward off horse archers or light cavalry charges. Something like low-tier lancers are going to feel the pain of archers like this. It's really only heavier cavalry that withstands archer fire much more effectively. Having a look at the stats of the Orc Hunters of Khazad-Dum, 124 men in the unit isn't bad by any means. I feel like I should say that the skirmish fight with the Orc Hunters of Khazad-Dum, you do need to be careful with how you take them. Mainly because they're not going to give you the skirmish advantage a lot of the time, particularly against something like the elves, or if the Kingdoms of Men really decide to focus on the skirmish side of their army. Chances are the Orc Hunters won't give you the victory there. What they can do, however, is force the enemy to bring archers, because decent archers anyway, because if they don't, the Orc Hunters will give you the skirmish advantage against basic stuff, against basic human archers, basic orc archers, that sort of thing. They are better than them, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that, their missile attack is 7, and a missile damage of 7 is really not bad at all. And they also have some pretty decent stats to boot as well. I mean, they're obviously superior in melee to a lot of stuff like basic human archers. So they do have some utility there when they pull out their dual axes. But just forcing your enemy to bring foot archers and skirmish with you, because most foot archers are not going to trade efficiently with the vast majority of the Orc army, the Khazad-Dum army. The Orc Hunters of Khazad-Dum aren't the best at trading. I mean, they do have the armor value of 7, but they don't have a shield value, which means they will probably lose the skirmish fight against decent archer units, but then the enemy has archer units which are not really going to do all that well in melee. They're not going to do all that well at doing damage to the Dwarven line. Most of the Dwarven infantry is going to be very, very resilient to archers. So it is an interesting one, and just the fact that the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum can engage in long-range fighting really helps them, I feel like. It really gives the Dwarves a different dynamic, and on an open field, of course, the Orc Hunters of Khazad-Dum, I feel like, will perform the role of helping to zone out lighter cavalry and forcing the enemy to bring archers very well. In a siege, of course, they'll just act like basic archers. Other than that, though, there's not really much else to say about the Orc Hunters of Khazad-Dum. They're not fantastic, but as I said at the start, just the fact that they give Khazad-Dum a viable, long-range skirmish option makes them worth remarking upon. The fact that you can have 3 before the cost increases does mean that your skirmish line is likely going to be, even if you bring all 3, the enemy could easily outnumber your archers, so that is something worth taking into account as well. You will need to be a little bit more careful with regards to who you're fighting. If you're fighting someone who you think is going to have a pretty hefty amount of archers anyway, it might be worth foregoing them entirely and just making your line as difficult as possible to get value out of archers as possible, because stuff like the 4th Legion Shield Guard, of course, will absorb archer fire relatively well as being a deterrent against cavalry. So while they may not be for every matchup, the fact that I've said before, the fact that they give the Dwarves that skirmish option could be invaluable in certain cases. The only other ranged unit that Khazad-Dum have on foot is the Khazad-Dum Reclaimers, and they are a very close ranged unit because they are the axe throwers, of course. Now, in the previous patch, they were probably the most deadly hand projectile unit in the game. That is much more debatable now, considering the amount that have been added with the addition of Linden and Rudour. But they are still very, very powerful indeed. You can have 2 before the cost increases, which is interesting enough. That's actually changed since the last time I played as Khazad-Dum. And this does give them potentially another deterrent against cavalry, in that if cavalry gets too close and they don't notice the Khazad-Dum Reclaimers, they can throw their axes. But of course, the Khazad-Dum Reclaimers are going to be a huge target for both enemy archers and enemy cavalry. Simply because they don't have a shield value. They do have a pretty hefty amount of armor, so low tier archers won't really scratch them. Higher tier archers will have a bit more luck with the lack of that shield. The missile attack of 12 is very powerful, and of course, as axe throwers, that missile attack is AP, so it's not really going to make a difference how armoured your unit is. The Khazad-Dum Reclaimers are going to do a pretty hefty amount of damage, Axe throwers, provided they get a very clean view of fire, are going to do a lot of damage to just about anything. They are also very accomplished melee fighters as well, as I'm sure you've noticed. The melee attack of 13 is very high. A total defense of 19 is also pretty decent considering they don't have a shield. It means their skill of 7 is not bad, but of course their armor of 12 is where the majority of their defense lies. They don't have multiple HP anymore, and they do cost 975, which is a lot. It is a lot for a unit which is going to be made a target of. However, their prowess in melee as well as at range is really what sets them apart. A lot of other javelin units can potentially be just one-trick ponies as soon as they're, I say javelin unit, hand projectile units. As soon as they've thrown their payload, they can be a bit of a liability in melee. Not so with the Khazad-Dum Reclaimers. In fact, I think, you see they have a bonus fighting cavalry and are effective against armor. I think that applies to them in melee as well, because when they're in melee, they pull out a two-handed axe, which, again, that could be very, very useful indeed. I mean, that bonus against cavalry in melee means if you have them in loose formation, cavalry which charges into them, even if they do get a good charge off, they could still take damage. So, potentially good in an open field, provided you have the means to defend them. But really, obviously, in a siege is where they're going to shine most of all, when they have the terrain and the walls and the buildings to defend them from enemy skirmish fire. And obviously the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum in general are going to do very nicely in a siege most of the time, provided they have the right composition. But yeah, 2 before the cost increases surprises me actually. But now we shall move on to the limited, but still present at least, Khazad-Dum Cavalry. Unlike their footbound brethren, the mercenary cavalry are a very integral part of how the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum will have to do business on an open field, because they give them the mobility that their very slow infantry lacks. Now, the mercenary cavalry are, of course, not an aggressive cavalry unit. They are a melee cavalry unit, meaning they will be best served just blocking enemy cavalry from getting their charges off, trying to force enemy cavalry into a sustained fight, because this is where their bonus versus cavalry will come into play, and it will... They're very cost effective at trading with other cavalry, to be honest, mercenary cavalry. It's going to take either much higher tier melee cavalry or really high tier knight units to knock them over quickly. Wargs will also do the trick, but this is a very important part of their army. Against a very lancer heavy faction, something like Rohan for example, or something like Arthedain, the mercenary cavalry are going to be very, very important at blocking those charges and really helping your infantry sort of stay in their rigid formation. The mercenary cavalry also have an upgrade model as we sort of scoot down the line over here, although I'm not entirely sure what the differences are. They look very, very similar across the board. I'm sure there are slight differences, but the again, it's similar to the Dwarven Miners, where it's only going to be individual unit models that you see this on. But having a look at their stats, when you compare them to other cavalry, the mercenaries tend to be on the same level of human cavalry of a similar cost to them, maybe slightly lower tier than that. And obviously they do have a bit of a morale problem as well. Obviously, again, men who fight for pay are less likely to stick around and fight to the bitter end than for those who are fighting for their homeland. But having said that, they are pretty indispensable to the Dwarves in an open field. You're not going to see them in a siege battle, of course, because that's a situation in which the Dwarves can really just hunker down and let the enemy come to them. But even so, the merchants, very key part of how the Dwarves do business in an open field, with their bonus versus cavalry and melee and their mobility. And of course, where the mercenary melee cavalry are, the mercenary crossbowmen can also be found. Again, in a very similar vein to the mercenary cavalry, this is all going to be about playing defensively with them to try and ward off enemy cavalry. And the mercenary crossbows can do this very effectively, of course, with their AP missiles. Now, the danger, of course, with the mercenary crossbowmen is if you catch them in melee, they will pretty quickly break against the vast majority of things, especially if they receive a nasty lancer charge, or particularly if wargs get into combat with the fear that they can imbue. But the mercenary crossbows should always be on the move. Microing them is going to be very important to your success in an open field as Khazad-Dum, because the mercenary cavalry on their own will not be able to hold back a lot of the higher tier cavalry. Again, when it comes to fighting higher tier cavalry, like the likes of Dol Amroth, for example, the best bet you have is to try and affect the fight with outside means, and the best way that Khazad-Dum can do this is with the mercenary crossbows. Now, I have noticed that the mercenary crossbows tend to have a little bit less stopping power than their footbound brethren, which is why I listed the lack of foot crossbows as a bit of a weakness of Khazad-Dum, particularly with how the Dwarves traditionally play. Having said that, you can kind of use them as a foot crossbow replacement, depending on how you want to play, but because of how the mercenary crossbowmen need to be used in terms of helping the mercenary cavalry ward off enemy cavalry, it's unlikely you're going to be able to use them to really help your flanks in a pinch, because enemy infantry will try and get around you. But having said that, the mercenary crossbows, I mean, they are what they are. You know, they provide AP missiles on horseback, which sounds OP, but in practice it really isn't, because the mercenary crossbows will be made a target of, and if the enemy brings horse archers, the horse archers can outrange them, and without a shield and with an armor value of 7, which isn't terrible, but it's still not fantastic, the mercenary crossbows, well actually yeah, an armor value of 7 is pretty low, isn't it? The mercenary crossbows will be pretty handily dealt with by horse archers. Even a single unit of horse archers can really make life difficult for the mercenary crossbows. So yeah, definitely a micro-intensive unit, but potentially can really help you ward off that cavalry, and if you can do that with the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, you're sitting in a very good place indeed. You can treat this as a bit of a public service announcement, to be honest with you, because the ballista for the Dwarves is meant to, at this stage, just be a standard ballista, but there is a bit of a holdover, as it were, from the testing, that means that the ballista, as it stands at the moment, you shouldn't take them as the Dwarves, for a reason that I will demonstrate in just a moment. But that doesn't matter too much anyway, because the Dwarven catapult is meant to be what you want to bring. So just imagine, because this is meant to be a faction overview that's going to sort of stand the test of time, as it were, and I won't need to do another one when the full version releases, because I can't see the mechanics of the game changing too much. So it's meant to be a standard ballista, but I think it's worth.
Attack!
I don't think I need to really say anything here. But we just.
Only half the enemy force remains.
Yeah, so naturally that is not what is supposed to happen. This was more of a joke unit that was added at some point in the testing and they forgot to take it out. But yes, it's meant to be a standard ballista, so if you're playing a game, please don't try and take advantage of players who don't know that this unit is in the game and bring it along, because it's not going to be fun for them and you're not really going to be proving anything by using it, because if you bring this ballista at long range it can devastate an army. This wasn't really even the best sort of demonstration of it, because it's only a single unit that was in a relatively long formation. If you see a cluster of units, it's going to wipe them out completely. So yeah, it's meant to be a standard ballista, but as it stands at the moment, that is what it is. But that doesn't matter anyway, because as I've said, the attractive artillery piece that you're supposed to want to bring as the Dwarves is the catapult, because this is a unique artillery piece that is meant to be in the game. And you may notice that it is a little bit more expensive than a standard catapult with 1300. Again, the melee stats don't really matter. If your catapult crews in melee, it's because they're either out of ammo or they're doomed because the catapult has been exposed. But yes, the main thing here is the area attack. And they have multiple projectiles that fire per volley, and not in the OP way that you just saw with the ballista, but in the way that if all of the projectiles were to connect, it would do more damage than a standard catapult, but individually the projectiles do less damage than a standard catapult. So it is worth bearing that in mind as the demonstration will commence. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that we'll be able to see it wipe out an entire unit. But yes, the primary reason behind this is to force your opponent to come to you, because the panic this can instill in another player as they see about 15 fiery balls coming towards their army is pretty extreme. I mean, it can make players charge forward and make mistakes, which as the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, your front line is going to be able to rip an unprepared enemy assault to bits, because your infantry is going to be so superior to the vast majority of armies that you're going to be facing. Again, the primary reason to bring the catapult in an open field, I think, is the panic that you can instill in enemy armies, and also the fact that it can give you the ranged advantage most of the time. I mean, particularly if you have your archers, even if the enemy are there. I mean, the elven archers could probably cut your catapult down to size pretty quickly, but I would say that strategy to use against the elves is going to be somewhat different anyway. So, yeah, the catapult is potentially a very lethal tool, and obviously in a siege it can be as well, for reasons that I think we can demonstrate now. So yeah, you can see that multiple projectiles will fire out of the catapult, and again, it's not really the best sort of demonstration of it with just a single unit, but again, I was only wanting to showcase the unit models really, as opposed to how they work in practice, because that would, that's more of a thing for another time. I think I will be going through if people want me to go through individual units and how they perform in an environment that they are ideal in, then I will do that. But obviously this is more of a faction overview rather than a unit overview. But yes, the Dwarven Catapult, this is something that they share with their cousins to the east in Erebor, so it isn't something completely unique to Khazad-Dum. But I would say that Khazad-Dum rely on this slightly more than Erebor. And potentially in a siege it can be devastating, of course. But I would also say bringing it in an open field as Khazad-Dum is going to be very much worth it. So that is the entire unit roster for the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum that we have just gone through. So in summary, what can we say about the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum? Well, if you're a defensive player, they are definitely going to be the sort of thing you're going to want to check out, because in an open field or in a siege, being on the defence is what they really excel at. That's not to say they can't be offensive. They certainly can on a siege, of course, with all that mass and with all the pushing power that the Dwarves come with, as well as the AP. It's more difficult to be aggressive in an open field with them because they don't have some of the tools that their eastern cousins do, which sort of allow them to be a little bit more aggressive. But it's not impossible. Certainly against certain factions they can do so. But really being defensive and really trying to absorb that pressure and win a war of attrition is how you're traditionally going to want to do so as the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum. It's very important that you try and make the enemy come to you in these situations. The catapult is going to be your primary means of doing so, with that multiple projectile shots that they have. Also the archers can certainly help you do this. It is going to be more difficult to do so against the elves, but the elves are really the one situation in which I can picture the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum being aggressive, leveraging some of their numbers, really going a little bit more shield and infantry heavy and trying to just batter them out of the way, which I can certainly see being a very viable strategy for them as we sort of look onto this Dwarven mine here, as the Orc Hunters completely ravaging the units as they approach. But yes, for me personally, the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum are not exactly my cup of tea, purely because they are a little bit overly defensive for me in an open field. Certainly in a siege, you're going to have a great time playing as the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum, especially if you're on the defence, purely because the amount of punishment they can take is really very high. Again, staying power was one of the strengths I listed at the start, for good reason. The morale, shields and armour of the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum is in excess of their eastern cousins over in Erebor, and it's one of, if not the most impressive set of such numbers in the game. But as I've said, they are potentially the most defensive faction in the game as well, purely because they don't have the skirmish power of some of the more... Well, they don't have the ability to defend against cavalry that some of the other factions have in the game. I mean, even Gondor, with their lack of melee cavalry, their complete lack of melee cavalry, have the AP spears to really cover their backlines a little bit more so. But, the heavy-duty nature of the Dwarves is certainly going to be for some people. I'm almost certain that Bobo is the one responsible for voting for the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum to be the first faction that I reviewed. But I can certainly see why people would like the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum. I mean, I do get that a lot of people do like to play defensive. They like to wall up, and a lot of people would refer to such things as noob boxing. But I would disagree. I mean, as the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum and the Dwarves in general, you have more of a license to do that, purely because it's how they are meant to be played. I mean, if you consider their homeland, the mines of Moria, Anzalbar-Doom, or I'm sure I've said that wrong, but Erebor as well, the Iron Hills, even when they're outside, they're in a situation like this where there's mines and there's big valleys and there's choke points, and they really are the masters of choke point fighting with their combination of axe throwers, artillery, spearmen, pikemen, and heavy infantry that can form shield wall. So yeah, if you like to play defensively, give the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum a try, because you'll almost certainly like them. If you like to be more aggressive, potentially they're not going to be for you, simply because of where their strengths lie. And they do have, that cavalry is going to be your worst enemy as the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum. You're going to have to find ways of trying to deal with that. So yeah, Balin's expedition ended in disaster. How will you fare?